Good morning. Welcome, everybody, to a live virtual event from the Center for New American Security in Washington, D.C. I'm Geoffrey Gertz. I'm a senior fellow here in the Energy Economics and Security program at CNAS. And today we are very excited to be launching a new CNAS report, Game Over, How the United States Could Have Won the Trade Wars, written by myself and my colleague, Emily Kilcrease. So the report summarizes a trade war game that CNAS hosted earlier this year in the lead up to President Trump's so-called Liberation Day, an announcement of very high tariffs. And the war game was really studying the question of how would foreign governments respond to significant tariff escalation from the United States. So clearly a question that has become very relevant in the real world in the months since then. I'll note the report is available freely on the CNAS website and encourage all of you to go download it and read the whole thing. But this morning, we'll provide an overview of some of the main findings in the report, as well as have a broader discussion about what's going on in the real-world trade wars, what lessons we could apply from the trade war game to the real-world trade wars, and some thoughts on where the trade wars and U.S. trade policy are going from here. So we have a fantastic international panel to discuss these questions today. First off, I'm very happy to introduce my colleague, Emily Kilcrease, who's the Senior Fellow and Director of the Energy Economics and Security Program at CNAS. Emily previously served as Deputy Assistant U.S. Trade Representative at USTR, where she oversaw the development, negotiation, and coordination of U.S. foreign investment policy, and earlier served on the National Security Council, as well as at the Department of Commerce. Great to see you again, Emily. Next up, we have Thorsten Benner, who joins us from Berlin, where he is the co-founder of the Global Public Policy Institute, or GPPI, an independent nonprofit think tank. He's also an adjunct faculty member at the Hertie School of Governance. Prior to co-founding GPPI in 2003, he worked with the German Council on Foreign Relations, the UN Development Program, and the Global Public Policy Project. Nice to see you, Thorsten. Next up, we have Meredith Lilly, who is full professor in Simon Reisman Chair in International Economic Policy at Carleton University's Norman Paterson School of International Affairs in Ottawa, Canada. Her research focuses on North American trade relations, Canada's trade diversification strategy, economic sanctions, and the use of research evidence in policymaking. Prior to her appointment at Carleton, she served as Foreign Affairs and International Trade Advisor to then Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper. Great to see you again, Meredith. And finally, last but not least, we have Wendy Cutler, Vice President at the Asia Society Policy Institute and the Managing Director of the Washington, D.C. office for ASPI. Prior to this, she worked for nearly 3 decades as a diplomat and negotiator in the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, including serving as Acting Deputy USTR. During her USTR career, worked on a range of bilateral, regional, and multilateral negotiations and initiatives, including the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, U.S.-China negotiations, and the WTO financial services negotiations. Great to have you with us, Wendy. All right, so Emily, I think let's kick off with you. You know, maybe for lots of our listeners coming to this who maybe not as familiar with sort of wargaming as an exercise, could you say a little bit about sort of, you know, why use a war game for understanding trade policy?
Yeah, absolutely. And before I dive in, I do just want to give a thanks to all of the panelists who are here today, as well as all of the colleagues around CNAS and from many other places outside of DC who participated in the game. It really is the players that make these sorts of exercises interesting and insightful. So thanks to all of them. And a particular thanks as well to Dr. Ed McGrady, an adjunct senior fellow with CNAS, who helped us design and execute the game. So why use a game? It does sound a little bit silly, but we know our colleagues in the military and defense world use gaming techniques all the time to think about how future conflicts might play out. And in our economics program at CNAS, we have found this to be a very helpful methodology to think about economic conflict as well. And so as we were anticipating early in the Trump administration, you know, an increase in escalation around higher U.S. tariffs, it was really interesting to think about, well, how might this unfold over a period of weeks, months, even years? And so that was the core objective of what we were trying to look at in this full day game that we ran in Washington, D.C., flying in experts from around the world to really look at the core question of the government-to-government negotiating dynamics. It was really kind of an international political economy game. If the U.S. is escalating tariffs significantly, how will foreign governments respond? And after they've been beat up by pretty heavy U.S. tariffs, would they make deals with the United States? And under what conditions? So it was a really interesting exercise. I have to caveat, it's not predictive. We can talk about where we landed at the end of that day-long gaming exercise, but it's much less about the destination, much more about the journey and kind of what we learned along the way.
Great, wonderful, thanks, Emily. So, maybe picking up on that question of sort of the journey, you mentioned we sort of ran this game before so-called Liberation Day, so before we were really in the thick of the trade wars, though obviously there had been a few trade war volleys at that point back in late March. But could you kind of talk us through a little bit, what was the scenario the game imagined? What was the kind of game that was playing out here?
Yeah, so we were trying to mimic and anticipate the real-world tariff events to the extent that we could. So the period that we ran the game over, the scenario lasted for about a year and a half. We had a U.S. team that was instructed to use heavy U.S. tariffs. Over the course of the scenario, we were also trying to throw in a bunch of distractions or provocations that might throw the trade talks off track. So, for example, we were throwing in security provocations and the like to see how that would potentially complicate or thwart dynamics. And so it was running from hypothesized at that time, Liberation Day, through a period of a year and a half to try to get to a point where we were just before the U.S. midterms and our political system next year.
Great. And maybe kind of wrap up here, what were sort of some of the major takeaways from the game? Kind of where did it land? What were the most interesting things for you from running the game?
Yeah, so there's 4 key insights that we identified in terms of how the government-to-government negotiations might unfold. Obviously, there's a lot more detail in the report, which folks should go ahead and look at if they're interested. But the first insight from the gameplay was that economic gravity is hard to fight. Even if the U.S. is being quite problematic in terms of raising tariffs, the strength of the U.S. market, the opportunity in the U.S. market is simply too attractive for most other trading partners to just ignore. They will try to find some sort of accommodation with the United States if they can. And so I do think the Trump administration has accurately identified the fact that the size and scale and attractiveness of the U.S. market does give them some leverage. Now, we can talk about what they're using that leverage for. We can talk about specifically China, where I think they've run into some more challenges with exploiting that leverage. But at the end of the day, economic gravity is a real thing that foreign governments have to contend with. They have to deal with the United States. A second key finding is that foreign governments can be fairly adept at de-escalating other issues if they need to be in order to keep the trade talks on track. This is something that we saw come out in the gameplay where, particularly for those countries where candidly, their economic survival depends on maintaining a trading relationship with the United States, they're able to be quite skilled in compartmentalizing issues, trying to de-escalate in other areas in order to keep the trade talks on track. Again, we can get into kind of this mix of economic and security issues and the ongoing real world trade wars, because that is a very new and kind of interesting dynamic. But what we saw in the game was that players were able to quite adeptly try to manage multiple issues in the relationship with the US team at once. The third finding was that when the teams were able to negotiate successful deals with the US team, it was when they were thinking broadly beyond just tariffs. So we saw economic packages that included tariffs, non-tariff regulatory barriers, certainly purchase commitments, investment commitments. And so country teams were thinking holistically about all of the economic issues that might be appealing to the US team, as well as kind of the broader political context. So that deal space had expanded, and that's what, in the game at least, was able to facilitate some successful deal making. The last highlight that I'll point out, I think this one is quite interesting when we think about how it's comparing to the real world, is the China dynamic. There's certainly a kind of a rhetoric out there that everything the US is doing right now is just a gift to China. But what we saw in the game was that other country teams, so we're talking about the EU team, the North America team, a lot of the other country teams, even when they were having a hard time dealing with the US team, they didn't automatically swing to the China team in order to diversify their trade away from the US market. They oftentimes would try to diversify with each other. So we saw a lot of activity and negotiation with Canada trying to work with the EU team, for example. But I think particularly for the advanced industrialized economies, they were kind of coming up with their own clear-eyed assessment of the economic and security risks of deepening integration with China. And they didn't automatically go to China if they thought that there was still an opportunity or a need to work directly with the United States. Now, the one caveat to that is that that dynamic was different, I think, for many of the developing economies and for the global South, where they were just hedging really hard and mostly trying to stay out of the fight to the extent that they could, which is consistent with what we see in the real world, where these countries really saying, please don't make us choose between one or the other. And I will note one example from the game that I found really interesting was that there was a point in time where the Vietnam team tried to go to the US team, negotiate something, got rebuffed by the US team, told it wasn't good enough, and then they swung really hard to the China team. So I think that example, for what it's worth, it was one instance in the game, but I think it's helpful in thinking through the risks that the US runs if they're driving a really hard bargain with some of these smaller economies. So we can get into all of that. I hope we do. But those were the kind of key 4 findings from the game.
Great, wonderful. Thanks, Emily. So I do want to bring in our other panelists now. So I should note, all 3 of our panelists were players in the game, so sat on the teams representing foreign governments that were sort of across from the notional negotiating table from the Trump administration in our game. So maybe, Thorsten, start with you, kind of, keen to hear both your sort of high-level takeaways and, what did anything you learn about trade policy from playing in the game?
First of all, thank you for having me, both at the game, Emily and Geoff, and here at the discussion. A great report. And what I learned is about the usefulness of playing these games. As you say, it sounds a bit like, not silly, but, non-serious for the uninitiated, at least. And once you do it, you really learn to cherish. And especially if you have such a great, the CNAS team was just outstanding in terms of how well this was prepared and how well this was carried out. So I learned a ton. At the same time, playing simulations in the age of Trump is also, because the real life simulation that we live through every day is inevitably crazier than what you play in a game. And I think the real life story of these trade wars has borne that out. That has to do, I think, partly with the biases of the players. To really get, Trumpian for the American team and for you as Trump, Emily, isn't all that straightforward. If you're trained as a lawyer who plays by the rules, if you're trained in one specific area that is trade, where you actually try to lower tariffs to get deals, and Trump is not that player. So I think some of the assumptions I learned have borne out, that about the attractiveness of the U.S. market. Unquestionably, that's the story that we've seen in real life. But the expanding the deal space to a degree, but that other countries have done that. The U.S. has been open to that. But unlike what I think we discussed at the time, nobody, the U.S. under Trump is not willing to lower the ceiling or the floor to below 10%. I don't think, I think some of the U.S. players were happy with 0 for 0 if they got a lot of other goodies, and I think we discounted the degree to which Trump just wants this as a revenue source and is not willing to go below that. I think we also overestimated the kind of countering China, the consistency in the way the U.S. plays this. We can go into greater depth, but I don't think we see with any sort of degree of consistency right now in the real Trump policies. Look at what he's doing with India, for example, which is not exactly what we foresaw in that. And we'll get into the EU a little bit, but I think this kind of willingness to de-escalate on security issues for getting to a deal on economic issues, maybe it's the other way around with Europe, that we actually, unhappily caved on security on the trade war in order to not have an escalation touching the security relationships.
Yeah, super interesting. And again, we will get into that further in a moment. But first, Meredith, maybe pull you in here. Kind of, what was your experience playing sort of on the Team Canada here, and how has that reflected what's happened in the months since the game?
Sure, thanks very much, and I echo Thorsten's comments that I had a lot of fun, and it was interesting and a great exercise. I think so. At the time that the game took place, there was actually quite a lot of aggressive rhetoric from the White House at that time, making Canada the 51st state. You know, really quite aggressive claims about the border. And so during the game, I think one of the things that we saw playing out is that Team USA kind of seemed impatient with Canada, that we weren't just accepting the premise of the tariffs on face value and the premise of the threats around the border. And I think the sense that I got is that they really wanted both Canada and Mexico to just sort of get with the program, and what can you do? What can you offer the United States to address this very real and serious issue? And while I'm not downplaying the issues that are in the United States, the extent to which Canada is responsible for those remains something that's like a live debate in our country. And so I think in the game, we kind of experienced this loss of momentum with Team North America initially, where we adopted very much a wait and see approach. And what we saw is other countries were kind of running towards the United States to try and get a deal in certain ways. And so as I reflect on that, and what's happened since then, I think that there is this continuing impatience with Canada in the United States, and that it actually does go beyond the White House. And so that's something that I kind of watch carefully. And, you know, I think I've seen that countries like the UK and the EU have come to the US with these very pragmatic deal-making intentions. And what you've seen from Canada since is, you know, we're still quite hedging and indignation perhaps about making unilateral concessions that violate USMCA from our perspective. And in exchange, all we get is higher tariffs. And none of that really seems like a very good deal for us. I think one of the ways that I was a bit surprised by the game, and perhaps Thorsten expressed this as well, is that I did feel like the American negotiators in the game were actually acting in good faith and were interested in achieving outcomes that benefited both sides. You know, you do this, we'll do this, great, everyone's happy. And I think that that's, and we also saw that on the China piece, where there seemed to be this real and genuine interest, both in the game and also in the margins of the game and the conversations that I was having with other players, that there was a genuine interest by Team USA in cooperating with other countries on China. Those aren't things that I think that we see in daily life with the Trump administration. I think instead we see a bit of a multi-front trade war with friend and foe alike. And so perhaps that's part of the reason that the game resulted in success all around, or at least some successes in a way that I'm not sure we're seeing, at least from the perspective of Canada, in reality today.
Great, thanks, Meredith. Yeah, I do think there's a kind of common theme running throughout this that, you know, we saw both in the game and the real life that U.S. has a lot of leverage in these trade wars, but sort of to what ends is it trying to put those leverage is maybe a big open question we'll come back to. So Wendy, I'd love to kind of pull you in here. You know, can you share sort of your reflections on the game, maybe thoughts on sort of how what happened in the game has or has not mirrored what we've seen in real life? Again, particularly kind of thinking through the flurry of trade deals we've seen in the Asian region over the last few weeks.
Sure. And like others, it's really my pleasure and delight to join all of you. And I really enjoyed being a participant in our actual trade war game. But I must say, like, it feels like years ago that, you know, every day since then has been just a long day in the trade world. In terms of just this leverage point, I couldn't agree more with Emily that the determination of countries to retain or improve access to the U.S. market has been a huge motivating factor, right? And has led countries not to walk away, for the most part, from these negotiations. But I think another point of leverage is Trump's unpredictability and a fear from trading partners that even if they were to retaliate, he will counter-retaliate, and then we will spiral into kind of, you know, a full-fledged trade war. And so when I observe what's happened over the past 90 days, you haven't really seen many countries threaten retaliation, putting China aside, which has retaliated. The EU talks about retaliation, and they prepared, but I never got the feeling that they were on the verge of walking away and, you know, and imposing the retaliation. And I think it's one of the big reasons is just a fear that they'd be met with, you know, even more tariffs, and it would be hard to unwind. I found, you know, just my overall comment, I think, on the war game, on our negotiations in this war game, again, and picking up on something Meredith said, I thought we were all too civil and we were all too kind of respectful and wanting to make a deal and, you know, kind of had the same kind of objective. And I think what we've observed over the past 90 days is just a lot of questions, a lot of drama, a lot of chaos, and a lot of uncertainty. The deals, we've seen the goalpost move, and interestingly enough, we've also seen where our ministers, our cabinet officers would like agree on stuff with countries, but always say we need to bring these deals to Donald Trump, and we've seen Trump kind of add, you know, either add more requests or say that deal isn't good enough. And that's kind of a very different dynamic than in the 30 years of negotiations I did at USTR. Look, the president always made the final decision, but round to round, meeting to meeting, we had instructions that were cleared by other agencies. If we had a serious problem on a sensitive issue, the USTR would call the president in real time during that negotiating round. And so this sequencing, I think, has also contributed to kind of more uncertainty and kind of a hesitation from countries. Why put everything on the table right now if indeed you're going to be asked to do more when it goes to the White House? Other speakers mentioned, you know, the fact that these deals were largely one way. The U.S. won. It was a win-lose proposition when our trading partners who have concluded deals, when they talk about their success, it's not in terms of like, we achieved this, we got access to this, we got rid of that U.S. barrier. It's more that, hey, we didn't get the 25% tariff, we got it down to 15%. And for Korea, like one of their biggest wins that they brag about is they didn't have to further open their rice and beef markets, very sensitive sectors there. But I would highlight that because in any negotiation I've been in, they've been more win-win. And so both sides could point to affirmative things that they got out of the negotiation. One of the important dynamics over the past 90 days is that countries have been watching closely what their neighbors, competitors, and other countries were getting or not getting, and learning from that. I think in our war game, we weren't able to really appreciate that dynamic as much. So, for example, once Japan reached a deal, there was no way that Korea could not reach a deal. Once, you know, the EU got 15% on autos, there was no way that Japan could bring home a deal with less than 15%. When Vietnam reached a deal with 20% tariff, all the ASEAN scurried to get a better rate, and it's no coincidence that most of them who we reached deals with came in at 19%. So I think that dynamic has been very important, and while I appreciated it, I think over the 90 days, I think that has really led to a lot of deals being concluded towards the end. And maybe I'll just conclude with one thing that has just surprised me as a longtime trade person about these negotiations. And that is, not only was the U.S. willing to violate its WTO obligations and FTA obligations in these negotiations, and I fully expected that, and I understand why they did. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but, you know, the current rules and the current kind of balance in the trading system, one could argue, disadvantages the United States now and doesn't take into consideration the realities. But other countries, particularly the EU, in agreeing with the United States, basically violated its WTO obligations as well, as far as I can tell. And that, to me, was like just a dynamic I wasn't expecting. I thought a number of countries would walk away from these deals saying that, you know, if you want to violate the WTO, that's one thing. We're not prepared to do so.
Great. Thanks so much, Wendy. Yeah, tons in there on future of the WTO, the sort of competitive dynamics among the different countries negotiating with the U.S. And yeah, sort of also, like you, very struck by the fact that, we have not seen a lot of proud press releases or statements coming out from our negotiating partners negotiating deals with the U.S. We see a lot of kind of flashy language from the White House and kind of silence, if anything, from negotiating partners. I'm going to go back to Emily in a moment. First, do want to remind our audience that is listening, we would love to bring your questions into this as well. So please do join the conversation. So you can go to cnas.org/live and use the chat box, or on Twitter, on X, use the hashtag CNAS2025. And we'll kind of weave those conversations and comments into the discussion as we go. So Emily, I do want to go a bit deeper maybe on the sort of U.S.-China dynamic. So sort of mentioned briefly, Wendy was talking about we haven't seen many countries retaliate, but the one that really did was China. And we did have this sort of spiraling escalation of sort of tariffs rapidly coming up and then coming back down. So I think, in the game, we had a superficial U.S.-China deal, but didn't really kind of resolve any of the kind of longer-term tensions in that economic relationship. Curious your thoughts on sort of how is the Trump administration approaching the China trade relationship? Do you think there's any prospects for a kind of bigger, longer-term deal here?
Yeah, so I'm personally skeptical about kind of how, the possibility of a grand bargain between the U.S. and China. Now, clearly, that's something the Trump administration is pushing for, and they're making all sorts of efforts at this point to, lay a kind of positive foundation for that relationship right now. And we could talk about, negotiating away export controls, or, the reporting that the White House has discouraged Taiwanese President Lai from doing a transit visit, right? Like, there's all sorts of things that typically a U.S. administration would not do that this administration has done in order to try to get to that summit between Presidents Trump and Xi. But the question is, well, what could a deal look like there, right? One interesting thing about this dynamic that we saw play out in the game was the impact of the effort by the U.S. to get a deal with China, kind of how that kind of has a ripple effect through all of the other negotiations. So how this played out in our game was that, kind of midway through, the U.S. team was taking a tough stance on China, and then in my role as President Trump, issued a post on Truth Social that said, actually, no, I want to deal with China now. And so all the negotiators literally froze, went back to the rooms, got new instructions, and then all of the counter-China initiatives that the U.S. had been working on with other country teams just froze. Like, no country team really wanted to think seriously about de-risking from China if the U.S. was no longer pushing that effort. Like, no other country team wanted to be left holding the bag, so to speak, when it came to de-risking from China if the U.S. wasn't going to be leading on that. And so I do think it's an important question about how much that's going to play out in the real world right now, as the U.S. is really moving forward hard on pursuing a deal with China. They are showing more willingness to negotiate over things like export controls, where traditionally the U.S. has said, that's not something we negotiate over. We don't negotiate with China on national security matters. And so if I'm, for example, Japan and the Netherlands, who's been on the receiving end of a lot of U.S. asks on things like export controls over the past couple of years in critical sectors like semiconductors, all of a sudden I'm really questioning, what the U.S. strategy is. And if there's going to be an ask of those sorts of countries on things like export controls or any sort of de-risking effort, I do think they have to ask kind of how durable the U.S. position is going to be on these issues.
Great. Wendy, just maybe kind of briefly come back to you. I know you've spent a lot of time thinking about U.S.-China dynamics, sort of sitting across the negotiating table from your Chinese counterparts during your time at USTR. Kind of what are your thoughts on how this administration has been focusing on China?
Yeah, so I just feel like the policy is a work in progress because there's so many conflicting steps being taken. Emily just highlighted this kind of a softer approach now in the lead up of any possible meeting between President Trump and President Xi, including, you were very diplomatic, Emily, but I would just say telling the Taiwan president, you're not going to come transit right now through our country. And also, the fact there's no trade deal with Taiwan, part of me thinks that is because they don't want to take that risk and announce it in case China pushes back. And, you know, we've seen other steps along those lines, but at the same time, we've seen the, you know, high tariffs against China. We've seen the de minimis threshold being lifted, which Chinese companies have benefited from. We've seen very tough action under the shipbuilding Section 301 petition. And so, you know, it's kind of, again, a policy is a work in progress, although I think now for the coming months, in the lead up to the APEC meeting in Korea, where if the president is going to go to China, it'd likely be around that event, we'll probably see a push for some type of deal with China, but there's not a lot of time to do one. So my view would be, like, if there's going to be some kind of deal, it's really going to be of a commercial nature, including big purchases by China, and maybe the president would take some CEOs with him and there'd be some new business deals announced. But the type of deal we saw during Trump 1.0 that Ambassador Lighthizer led, the phase 1 deal, which was about 50, 60 pages, including not only purchases, which everyone focused on, but frankly, a lot of rules-based chapters. I just don't see the interest in that this time around. I could be wrong. Secretary Besson does talk about the need to deal with structural problems like excess capacity and stimulating Chinese domestic demand. But I've learned through the years that these structural issues, while valuable to go after, it takes a long time to yield results. And so they should be accompanied by other more immediate measures as well.
Yeah, definitely. Pushing a rock up a hill, trying to get progress on those Chinese structural issues, I think is one way to put it. So, Thorsten, maybe kind of go back over to you here. You know, we had this U.S.-EU trade deal announced last week. I think, as you kind of alluded to, been lots of criticism in the press, particularly in the European press, of sort of, you know, how bad Europe did in those negotiations, maybe we could say. You know, could you unpack for us a little bit, kind of, why do you think we got to this position? I think you said a moment ago that Europe kind of unhappily caved in its kind of negotiations with the U.S. administration here. I saw just today, again, they're sort of, you know, putting off any retaliation for at least the medium term. Kind of, what are the negotiating dynamics that led to that rather one-sided deal?
Yeah, it begs some explaining, because we signed something that is reminiscent of the unequal treaties China was forced to sign in the 19th century in terms of the lopsided nature of what we did sign. But I think you can only explain this not by the lack of cards to play. I mean, we have beautiful analysis by Tobias Gerke from ECFR, also a player in our game in terms of all the cards Europe could have played economically. That's fine. We could have even risked trade escalation but I think the very simple explanation is our vulnerability on the security front, and Europe needed to play a consistent game. Once you had agreed within NATO to play the game of submitting to Trump and making outlandish promises to keep him engaged in NATO and not make him rip up security guarantees, and NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte does a beautiful job at kind of, you know, trying to, you know, please Trump and make the allies come up with all sorts of promises. In the NATO case, it was 5%. And I think it could only, you know, we needed consistency. You can't go for submission in the NATO camp and then go for escalation or like going for an escalate to then de-escalate strategy on the economic front, because Trump would have simply been able to shift gears and to say, okay, the security stuff, you don't seem to be really committed to the relationship, so I'll rip this up. And with a live war on our doorstep in the middle of Europe, I think is too much of a. I think European countries were divided to begin with in terms of, I think the French side was more willing to escalate. The German side, also quite interestingly, toward the end of the negotiation, was really furious about Trump having ripped up the interim agreement they had achieved, and were considering, you know, not achieving a deal, going with the 30%, coming up with countermeasures, and so on. But I think in the end, once von der Leyen went to the private estate of Trump in Scotland and did the final round of negotiation, I think that's the best I think Europe could hope for. The details of which are unclear, and I think it's it's a lopsided thing. But let's also take, all other things being equal, that the tariffs on the rest of the world stay where they are. The tariffs on imported inputs for U.S. manufacturing staying as they are. It may not turn out to be a catastrophic deal for Europe. It doesn't give any certainty to Europe. That's the problem. But I think the bottom line, and I think Europeans shouldn't kind of berate the Commission for signing this deal. They did this on behalf of member states prioritizing security. And we shouldn't lose sight, and circling back to the China issue, I think China's challenge for the European industrial base is much more fundamental than the challenge posed by Trump, because the U.S. industry players won't be a problem for Europe on third markets, and we'll have some issues on the U.S. market, and it will be painful for some, especially if we don't get to a deal with quotas on steel and aluminum. But some of these details are still up in the air. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that I do think China is, the competition from authoritarian state capitalism, a much more fundamental challenge to Europe's industrial base. And we're in the unenviable position to need to, we need to de-risk against, from both China and the US at the same point, because I don't think it's very realistic to achieve a lot of kind of common ground with the administration right now on China policy, where they would give us something. Maybe these quota on steel and aluminum, but I don't see much more right now in the offing. I might be wrong. I hope to be wrong, but it doesn't seem to be the consistent policy of Trump to get allies on board with his China strategy.
Yeah. Great. All right, Meredith, let's bring you in. We actually have a question in the chat here on some of Canada's negotiating strategy. So, Canada obviously was one of the first targets of Trump's trade war, as you mentioned, attacks on sovereignty, all of that going back to February, really. We saw Canada kind of fall out of the crosshairs for a little bit. We did see last Friday in the new tariff announcements that there was a 35% tariff on Canada, but with the very important caveat that goods covered under USMCA, the North American Regional Trade Agreements, will be exempt from that tariff. So, curious sort of generally your view from Ottawa on sort of, how is Canada positioned at the moment? And again, there's a specific question here from Mara that asks, does Canada really sort of not see a lot of reason to negotiate with the United States right now, given the USMCA carve-out, unless the U.S. actually moves on aluminum tariffs and the kind of importance of aluminum and steel for the auto manufacturing industry? Is that where the negotiations are really going to focus on North America?
Okay, yeah, there's a few things in there. So, I think that things did quiet down, at least initially in the early days of Prime Minister Carney having been elected and kind of resetting relations, I think, with Canada. I also don't think that has lasted very long. So while it's not making headlines, I think there's actually a lot of very quiet frustration on both sides. Some of that comes from certainly the 50% tariffs on steel and aluminum, although there's a difference there. The 50% tariff on aluminum really is hurting U.S. firms. The United States can't meet its own aluminum demand. It needs to buy it from Canada, and so Americans are going to pay 50% more for that privilege, and that's not going to go away anytime soon unless American firms push on the U.S. side. So we actually have less of an urgency about dealing with that piece of it. But the 50% on steel, I think, really is biting. Jobs are being lost. The domestic steel firms is seeking a bailout. So there's some real, I think, genuine challenges there. The question about the relationship with USMCA, certainly the fact that we have this carve out on USMCA compliant goods really means that essentially about 95% of Canadian exports would qualify for tariff-free treatment, provided that all the paperwork is filled out and you meet rules of origin and so on. And so in many ways, that puts both Canada as well as Mexico in quite an enviable position relative to other countries, because the overall tariff rate is quite a bit lower than the 15% that most other countries are experiencing. So that's certainly important. Now, I don't think that Canada is just kind of down tools as a result of that, because I think there's a genuine concern about whether the USMCA carve-out will remain in effect if negotiations don't continue. And so we are, I think, stuck a little bit between a rock and a hard place on these issues at the moment. It's causing a lot of problems domestically. The perception that the government is going to be in a position of negotiating for some sectors against others in the Canadian economy. There will be winners and losers, and this will sort of be decided between governments, and that always creates a lot of problems. So there are real challenges there, but I'm optimistic that continuing negotiations on USMCA will be important. The deal has actually become more important moving forward now that this carve-out exists, because certainly a 35% or a 25% tariff is not manageable across the entire economy. And so the deal, despite the fact that it's being violated, has become more important than ever.
Maybe I'll just kind of pick up on that a little bit, Muchi. So, obviously we have these sort of near-term negotiations going on the sort of 25%, 30% tariffs. There's also in the background this idea of sort of, are we going to have a sort of full renegotiation of USMCA, something that the Trump administration has sort of talked about in various kind of points of time up until now. Kind of, what's your thought on doing that, a real renegotiation of a sort of full trade agreement, sort of beyond just these sort of short little one-page statement of agreements that have been negotiated so far?
Yeah, well, I think we get a few hints. One hint that really has me concerned is that the Trump administration has made very clear signals that it's not looking to start that negotiation really until next year. And so that means to me that they intend to let the July 1st, 2026 deadline come and go, which puts us into a world of annual renegotiations, which is an outcome that those of us that care about USMCA and its continuation really wanted to see a continuation signed on July 1st, 2026, not the beginning of a renegotiation around that time. But we know that the Trump administration is going through the congressional processes right now, doing the consultations and all of that, which is positive, which tells me that it intends to advance that. Signals that I have, though, from the States is that there is not a desire on the U.S. side to seek trade promotion authority, and that likely wouldn't be effective or achieved. And so without that, the U.S. is kind of constrained in how broad that renegotiation can get. One of the concerns that I have is that I've heard from various people in the U.S. that the United States, while it may not seek trade promotion authority for a broad renegotiation, there's nothing stopping Canada and Mexico from just preemptively offering all kinds of goodies to the United States in order to keep things happy. That worries me, because if that is the desire, that we're just going to offer the moon in exchange for continued market access, and if that's an expectation, given how prone to reversal of his positions the president can be, we could see ourselves in hot water.
Yeah, tricky negotiating context there for sure. All right, a reminder to everybody listening to please send in your questions. Again, go to cnas.org/live and use the chat box, or on X or Twitter at hashtag CNAS2025. So we have a question here from Bradley from LexisNexis. So Bradley notes that we've talked about multiple deals have been struck, but do we think any of these will stick and end up being real substantial agreements, or do you expect continuous trade tensions and talks throughout the administration? So kind of welcome anyone to think on that, but Emily, maybe kick us off on that question.
Yeah, I mean, this is a fantastic question, one that we're all focused on right now. I mean, in theory, these kind of handshake political deals that have been struck over the recent weeks could then transition to more of a technical process where you start implementing some of these vague commitments and you move it towards a more regular order kind of rules-based approach. I would love to see things move in that direction, but candidly, we talk about this in the report where we end on a somewhat more pessimistic note, which is that there is a fundamental question about whether the Trump administration is committed to rules-based trade. And I'm not even talking about the WTO, like forget the WTO for this perspective, right? Like that's not even the conversation that we're having. It's a really more of a question of whether they will agree to binding rules with trading partners that would constrain future tariff threats or actions. And if you look at the evidence to date, like it's hard to see, or it's hard to argue that the Trump administration will, sign all these framework agreements and then just put their tools down and say, we're done doing tariffs and we're going to kind of just move on and things will be much more calm from here on out. And so I think it is a real question about the durability of these deals, and particularly if there's something that happens in one of these trading partners that is problematic from a broader foreign policy perspective, or is just something else that the Trump administration doesn't like, will they jack up the tariffs again? I do think that is a real risk. There's kind of a separate bucket of questions about, to what extent do external constraints still matter on the president's tariff actions, right? We've got ongoing litigation. You've got, inflation starting to creep up because of some of the tariff effects just a little bit now, but that could potentially get worse as time goes on. Like there's a whole bucket of things that may constrain the president, but I think that's an open question too, in terms of how much that actually matters. What we saw last week was that essentially Liberation Day 2.0, right? Like it doesn't seem to be constrained that much by those factors to date. So I do think that while it is helpful and positive that there is sort of a detente based on some of these framework agreements for the time being, I don't think anyone should feel like a great sense of comfort that these are really going to be necessarily in place for the next 3 years.
Great. Wendy, Thorsten, any thoughts on kind of whether these will stick?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Emily. I think these deals are very fragile. Mm-hmm. And, on one hand, I think it's really important to kind of memorialize these deals in writing so both sides are very clear about what they've agreed upon. But I'm so struck by the Japanese minister going home from Washington and basically saying he doesn't even want to put this in writing. And I think I understand why, because when you try and write down what you agree to, and this used to happen to us all the time, other issues come up and you realize that maybe you weren't on the same page on certain details. But I think in these negotiations, there may be a real gap between folks' understandings of just fundamental provisions of the agreement. So, for example, these investment funds that both Japan and Korea have announced, when you hear the Trump administration describe them, it almost sounds like Japan's going to be giving $550 billion in cash to the White House, and then they would just kind of dole it out and decide how they were going to spend it. And when you hear what Tokyo is saying, they're like $550 billion is a ceiling, and these are loan guarantees, and we're going to be making the decisions. Some will be joint. And so I think there's a fear that if you had to go to the table and actually write this down, that you're going to end up with the White House saying, you know what? Let's tear this one up and we're going to put on 25, 50% tariffs on you. So I find that dynamic, pretty strange, and something that I'm still trying in my own head to work through, because I think if you really don't agree, if there's really no agreement on what you supposedly agreed to, then the fragility of these agreements is just going to be even more, more stark. But that said, I think there's something to be said for having a détente and a truce now. But we're going to have the sectoral tariffs coming down the pike very soon. And the president just announced semiconductors and pharmaceuticals are coming. The other shoe that may drop, and I think folks need to pay attention to it, is the whole question of rules of origin. Like we've seen in some of the ASEAN deals, Vietnam in particular, that there's agreement on a 20% tariff, but then a 40% tariff for transship goods. Well, when does a good fall out of that 20% basket and all of a sudden is subject to the 40% tariff? The current rules of origin of substantial transformation, pretty weak. And so I think that we may see either the administration negotiating individually with countries, and they've said with Indonesia they're going to do that, or they may just announce, for all products or for most products going forward, we're going to require at least 60% local content and no Chinese content. Something, just something, I just think another shoe's going to drop on the rule of origin question.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, jump in, Meredith, please do.
Sorry, can I just add, I think also, I mean, everything Wendy said, I totally agree with. But on top of that, when you remember that trade is done by firms and not done by governments, you've got, this big picture of what the governments have supposedly agreed to, and there isn't a lot of clarity on it. Well, firms are asking very clear questions like rule of origin and transshipment and those kinds of things. And so until there is words written in black and white in text, you're going to see hesitation on the part of firms. They're not going to go running into the United States without understanding better what they're getting in return. And so I think we're going to come to a moment where the rubber's going to hit the road, and you're not going to see these promises of investment turn into real investment. And you're not going to see, a doubling down on improving trade until there's stability and certainty for the firms that actually trade.
Yeah, and Meredith, I would just underscore what you just said too. The purchase agreements too. Like some governments can buy, the fighter jets, but some of this other stuff, it's got to be purchased by private companies. And I think the EU has already just kind of walked away a bit from their mega billion-dollar commitment, saying, well, those will be, our companies are the ones who are going to have to pony up here. And I think those commitments are going to be kind of a work in progress for the next 3.5 years as well.
Yeah, I just add that. I think it was Secretary Bessent in the Japan context saying that, the Trump view was they were going to be sort of every 3 months looking at, is Japan meeting the terms of the agreement, and doing kind of quarterly reviews of if Japan's meeting the agreement. As you've both said, without clarity on what is actually in the agreement, is going to be very interesting to see how that goes. I think Meredith was just saying how difficult 1 year annual reviews for USMCA will be. I think the quarterly reviews, it could be even worse and even more uncertainty. I did want to go back to something Wendy mentioned earlier, which is a little bit sort of, what does all of this mean for the future of the WTO and a rules-based trading system? So, Emily, Wendy, and I are sitting in DC, a country that, for better or for worse, has kind of turned away from WTO for a fair bit and probably is not too plussed about kind of what all this means for the WTO. But, Thorsten and Meredith, you are both in capitals of countries that have really invested a fair bit into the WTO and really kind of view WTO as being kind of central to the global trading system and kind of put in a lot of effort to hold it up. How is sort of this question being debated in Europe, in Canada, and how much kind of existential worries are there about the future of the WTO? If you want to kick that off.
Maybe I'll start because I'm on the receiving end of foreign governments coming to Canada with some regularity now, suggesting that perhaps Canada is not abiding by the rules in the way that we were once seen. And so there's a bit of a disconnect between the way Canada sees ourselves, which is a very, good participant in rules-based trade. We're part of the, the Ottawa group where, the alternative dispute settlement system and the WTO and all of that. But at the same time, our exposure to the United States means that we are seeing some protectionist contagion taking hold here. And so we have made some announcements about procurement of government projects that involve steel and aluminum, and who gets to participate depends on whether you have a trade agreement with us. And so there are eyebrows being raised right now in Canada about our adherence to rules that we have always participated in, as I think in good faith. And now there's a question about whether we can be counted on because of our very high exposure to the United States. And so we're kind of grappling with that a little bit ourselves.
Thorsten?
No, look, part of the price tag the EU pays for this agreement is to look hypocritical in the eyes of others when we say we're the guardians of the rules-based international order. And but I think maybe it's about time to get real on this to begin with, because the tensions were there before we submitted to this unequal treaty. And the tensions don't just come from the US. They partly come from the US, as you can see that we signed this agreement, but they partly also come from, thinking about how to come to terms with the fact that we have a huge economy in the middle of the WTO that we thought would move into a more market-based direction, but has done exactly the opposite. And it's almost like an anti-systemic force in the middle of the WTO. And for Germany, that worked out for a long time, as long as we had a complementary relationship with China. But for both Germany and the whole of the EU, our deficit is widening. Our core economies are being targeted, and I think that has long led to a rethink whether you need to kind of at least stretch what is possible within WTO rules, or to go to a philosophy within the WTO as long as we can, but beyond the WTO if we must, to protect our interests against China. I think on the other side, I do think this will hopefully renew the drive in Europe to conclude trade agreements that the French side finally kind of okays the Mercosur deal that we're doing. I think both the India and the EU, after being trashed by Trump, should have an interest in concluding a trade deal. So I do think some of the other agreements that we're pursuing will find some, and that will be the way forward, and not just the focus on, on the WTO alone. I agree. We look, Europe looks pretty hypocritical on that front. But then again, many developing countries in Africa didn't look benignly on Europe just because we stuck by the WTO rules. They felt shortchanged anyway and didn't think it gave them anything. So I think many of our biggest critics are not mourning this, or they just say, that doesn't make a difference now. It's, we want market access and give us that market access, and we don't care about the WTO rules that much. I mean, we care about what we get for our economic interests.
Okay, well, we're close to wrapping up. We've got one more question here that came in from Eric, who asks, is there a window of opportunity and or appetite for further EU-India engagement following the recent EU-US trade deal and Trump's comments and actions towards New Delhi? Obviously, India is one of the sort of few countries that has, not reached a deal yet with the administration. We've seen kind of 25% tariffs and the threats of even higher tariffs tied to purchases of Russian oil. So kind of, briefly, Wendy, Thurston, any thoughts on EU-India rapprochement here?
Well, one thing I've learned in this new world, you can't rule anything out. And some of these trade deals or negotiations that looked impossible 6 months, a year ago, countries are revisiting. I mean, I found like really interesting the EU overture with the CPTPP countries. I don't think the EU is going to join the CPTPP, but I think we're going to see more integration there. And I think we may see like a Korea or other countries express interest in joining the CPTPP. So yes, so like again, EU, India may be back on the table. But, I'm one who's still from that old school where negotiating with India is just, through my entire career, has been such a heavy lift. And even though some of my closest colleagues were telling me, no, this time it's different. India's really going to, come through. I was a bit surprised. I was not surprised when they did not. But we saw India and I believe the UK conclude a deal just a few months ago. So I think we all need to pay a lot of attention to what's going on with respect to trade agreements among our trading partners that don't include the U.S. And I think over time, that's going to put more and more pressure on the U.S. to rethink its current trade policy, because being isolated and outside of these agreements is going to work to the disadvantage of the United States and our companies and their workers as they try and compete in the global economy.
Great, wonderful. So we are about at time here, but maybe just as we wrap up, I'll sort of ask all of our speakers to come in with closing thoughts. Maybe, one framing point, I think, we are now sort of past the August 1st deadline. We've seen these whole flurry of deals. You could look at that from the outside and say, all right, we're sort of through the trade wars, we got it all done. I think based on your comments, all of you would agree that that's probably not the case, that there's sort of more still to come here. So, in wrapping up, kind of what should we be looking for in this next phase of the trade wars? Maybe we'll start with you, Emily, and then go to Thorsten, and then Meredith, and then Wendy.
Well, first, I think we have to acknowledge that if you're sitting in the Trump White House, you probably think that you're winning the trade wars right now. Like, you're probably feeling pretty good, right? Like, if you look at the promises on the campaign trail, it was 10 to 20% tariffs from a universal basis and 60% tariffs on China. They've largely landed there without retaliation and gotten a whole bunch of investment commitments to boot, So I think, I would expect more of the same. I think they think the strategy is working and they're very comfortable with the framework deals because it maintains their leverage by keeping the other trading partners on edge. So I think that's my prediction for what that's worth in terms of how things will continue to unfold. It's, there's certainly going to be a sense that the strategy is working. So let's keep on rolling.
Great. Thorsten?
I think from the vantage point of the U.S. partners, Europe included, there's one certainty: things will remain uncertain and volatile with regard to Trump. So I think the conclusion should be, turn this sense of humiliation that Europe has out of this bruising negotiations into a renewed impetus for focusing on what we control. What we can control is kind of investing our own strength. And I think that's what the Canadians are doing, and that's what I hear Prime Minister Carney say, that we, Europeans need to do the same, reinvest in our own common market. There's a lot of room to run on that front, things that we can control. And things that we can control is actually working with other countries around the globe. It's not just the US. And so we should do that. Another thing we can control is finally get serious about investing in our own security and making ourselves less vulnerable to Trumpian blackmail. I mean, this is a longer term effort, but if we needed any proof that this is necessary, the time is now. So I think there's a lot of impetus we should take away from this sobering experience that we had with Trump so far, which will remain sobering, but I do think we can take away some good lessons for that, learning from our weakness.
Okay, thanks. Meredith?
Yeah, I think I have similar comments that I think countries perhaps have bought a short-term peace for now with these framework agreements, but I think Canada is not alone in getting serious about trade diversification and reducing our reliance on the Americans. Now, unlike most countries, we will continue to be more dependent than most. So Mexico and Canada, I think the United States will always be our #1 trade partner, but there are other countries that aren't in that position and will increasingly look to other alternatives than trading with the United States if it's not seen as a reliable trade partner. And, over time, the U.S. can use its market dominance for now, but over time, we might see that wane as other countries have other options and react and respond in their own ways, including by developing their own partnerships with others as a result. And then just one tiny final piece, though, is that I think I'm also quite concerned about the addiction of tariffs as a revenue source for the United States. And if they are allowed to stand through this administration, I actually think they'll be quite addictive and difficult for the United States to walk away from in even the medium term. And so that's kind of an ongoing concern that I think about.
Okay. And Wendy, last word to you.
Yeah, so I'm looking at this as a baseball game. We just got through inning 1, and I agree with Emily. I think that the U.S. did pretty well. But I think we have many more innings in front of us, and I think there's going to be a lot more drama on this front, and we're going to be living in a tariff world for the next 3.5 years, if not longer.
Great. Well, if nothing else, good news for those of us who professionally study tariffs and trade policy. We'll be keeping busy. Thank you to all the panelists for joining. Really enjoyed the discussion. Thanks for everybody who watched online and submitted great questions. Again, reminder, the report is called Game Over: How the United States Could Have Won the Trade Wars, available at cnas.org for download.